Hi, welcome to this next presentation on violence as a tool for the British Empire from the 18th century to the early 20th century. This presentation is going to be covering the colonisation of Australia and the violence and the expansion used in it by the British Empire, and it's been put together by Sam Bloomfield. So firstly, in the colonisation of Australia, unlike the other colonies that had been well established for many years, Australia was a very late addition to the British Empire. The first British efforts to colonise Australia began in 1788 with the arrival of 11 ships, with the majority of passengers being prisoners from Britain. Much like the earlier colonies, the colonies struggled in the early years due to the unfamiliarity with the land and the disorganisation amongst the colonists. Blight, fire, flood and drought regularly decimated the grape, maize and wheat crops. The first colony was known as New South Wales, which would become the base camp for future expansion and was where the British Empire's strength was most concentrated in Australia. Now, Aboriginal peoples are an interesting part of colonisation of Australia. The native peoples of Australia were, much like those in North America, dehumanised by the British Empire. Deschamps and Plum notes that the term Aborigine was given to the native peoples in an attempt to make them seem like the other, which gave effectively the colonists an excuse to expand their territory. While the initial settlements in New South Wales were mainly set up near to the coast, which would grant easy access for the British shipping, and it was relatively separate to the native peoples, though as the population grew in the new colony from the importation of more prisoners, more land was required to feed and house, expansion would become less pragmatic and would become more expansionist and profit-focused, especially on fertile sheep farming land, as they gradually encroached on Aboriginal land. Now, the nature of violence against native peoples is been talked about by Jan Kochiumbas, I think, demonstrates how the colonizers thought of the native peoples in three ways: their land, their labour, and their women. This clearly shows the dehumanization described by Deschamps and Plum. Kochiumbas introduces the discrimination against native women and how the colonists perpetrated sexual violence. Richard Broome quotes a reverend writing in 1825, describes the severity of the sexual violence that was perpetrated against native peoples. At night, by the shrieks of girls about 8 or 9 years of age, taken by force by the vile men of Newcastle. One man came to see me with his head broken by the butt end of a musket because he would not give up his wife. Now, mechanisms of violence used by the British. Kochiumbas notes the native peoples were employed into the native police force, which exploited the opportunistic elements of the native peoples, as the British Empire gave this police force weapons and horses to release themselves. This led to fighting amongst the native population, and he further notes that diseases such as smallpox, tuberculosis, and measles were often spread amongst the native peoples, decimating the population and having a limited effect on the white colonists as they had been exposed to these diseases directly or had genetic resistance, which the native people did not have. Kochiumbas notes that this was a form of biological warfare and that the British covered it up by describing diseases as a faceless killer, whilst ignoring the direct murder via shooting or poisoning food, that it was somehow the native people's fault that they had no resistance to European diseases. The idea of terra nullius, which, as Ben Kiernan notes, provided ample motive and excuse for the expansion of genocides. Michael Cannon describes terra nullius as the idea that a land is not owned by anyone and is free to be exploited by a dominant power. The colonists in this case decided that as the native Australian people did not have a concept of legal ownership, they could not claim the land on which they lived. Britain's position in Australia became more secure in the 1820s. Colonists sent out private expeditions to rout the native peoples who were resisting their expansion and abuse. While some of these expeditions were a response to small-scale raids by native peoples, the expeditions were often disproportionate response, as many natives were killed or disposed of their land unjustly. An abuse of power was present throughout the whole of Britain's treatment of Australia as well. Native labour was a key part of the Australian economy in the 19th century. Schroeder notes that native people were often moved from their hunting grounds and coerced into working in the sheep fields in exchange for clothes and housing that they were forced out of originally by the colonists. Furthermore, the native labor was also used during the gold rush in the 1850s through this relationship, though this relationship was noticeably more beneficial for the native people. Religion was also used to undermine the unity of the native population, as many were coerced into the Christian faith, and those who did not convert were often left vulnerable to violence. This undermining of religion furthered the erosion of the native people's culture, and was combined with the other measures to increase the colonists' control of the territory. So, in conclusion, while Australia was a late addition to the British Empire, the means of acquiring and expanding this territory was no less apparent in North America. In many ways, it was not outright planned, however. Some of them just happened by the will of the colonists who moved there and not the British government. The extreme use of violence against native peoples and the undermining of their culture should be seen as a genocide. Expansion of the Australian colonies and the growing colonial economy were driving factors for the relocation and killing of native peoples. Violence against Australian people did not change its nature until the later 19th century, as native numbers dwindled, so many were instead exploited for cheap labor. This is the bibliography used for this presentation, and next we're going to be looking at two different presentations on India. Thank you.